Are e-cigarettes actually safe? Over the last decade, vaping has exploded in popularity. Companies claim these devices can help people quit smoking and that they're harmless. But a lot of people aren't convinced, and for good reason. So let's break down what's really going on. An e-cigarette has three main parts: a battery, an atomizer, basically a tiny heater, and a cartridge filled with liquid, with or without nicotine. There's also a microsensor that detects your inhale and triggers the atomizer to produce vapor. Some devices even add a glowing tip for aesthetics. The big difference from traditional cigarettes is obvious. You're inhaling vapor, not hot smoke. The liquid that turns into vapor usually contains water, a solvent like glycerin or propylene glycol, and optionally nicotine. Glycerin and propylene glycol are common in food and cosmetics. Nothing exotic there. For comparison, when you take a puff from a regular cigarette, the tip can reach temperatures between 200 degrees Celsius and 600 degrees Celsius. That heat breaks down tobacco and produces thousands of chemicals, dozens of which are known carcinogens. E-cigarettes don't burn anything, so they don't create the same chemical cocktail. That alone makes them less harmful than traditional smoking, but less harmful doesn't automatically mean safe. Vaping only hit the global market in 2003, and long-term research is still catching up. Scientists simply haven't had enough time to fully understand all potential health effects. What we can say is that avoiding both smoking and vaping is the safest option. And what about quitting smoking? Do e-cigarettes actually help? Honestly, not really. Nicotine addiction isn't just chemical, it's behavioral. Even if you use nicotine-free liquid, you're still inhaling, still holding a device, still performing the ritual. That ritual is a huge part of the addiction loop. So while vaping may feel cleaner or smoother, it doesn't magically break the habit. It often just reshapes it. And that's baby science for you. Ever had this happen? You grab a pile of snacks, chips, popcorn, candy, crash onto the couch with a soda, binge something, and then suddenly your stomach reminds you that you're not 18 anymore. Congrats. There's a good chance you're experiencing heartburn. Let's break down what it actually is and where it comes from. If you've never felt heartburn, here's the vibe: a burning or uncomfortable sensation behind your chest bone, right where your stomach meets your esophagus. But discomfort in the esophagus can show up in other ways too: pain, irritation, a lump in the throat feeling, or a sour, bitter taste in your mouth. Your stomach, as you probably know, is not a peaceful spa. It's a chemical war zone, full of hydrochloric acid, digestive enzymes, and bile acids. Your stomach is built for that. Your esophagus, not so much. Even in healthy people, tiny amounts of stomach acid splash upward during the day. Normally, you don't feel it because your esophagus has two layers of protection: a mucus layer and a tough epithelial lining. Together, they can handle up to 50 acid splashbacks a day. But there are plenty of things that can overwhelm that system: junk food, soda, alcohol, certain medications, smoking, and the classic move, lying down right after eating. When the acid attacks become too frequent, the protective barrier breaks down, cells pull apart, gaps form, and stomach acid seeps into places it shouldn't be. That irritates nerve endings, and boom, heartburn. In medicine, this is called GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. Heartburn is its most common symptom, and it feels different for everyone. Some people feel warmth and burning, others feel sharp pain. Many get burping, sour taste, bitterness, or throat discomfort. Because so many people experience heartburn at least once, GERD often seems harmless. There's a persistent myth that heartburn is just normal digestion, and you should tough it out. But constant irritation of the esophagus can lead to inflammation, ulcers, and other serious complications over time. That's why it's important to get checked by a professional if symptoms keep coming back. The good news? We live in the 21st century. These things can be treated. But treatment alone isn't enough. Your body doesn't start throwing acid around for no reason. Unbalanced eating habits and unhealthy routines can disrupt how your digestive system works, so even solved problems can return if nothing changes. Eat real food, take care of your body, and watch smart content. And that's baby science for you. What's the secret behind great artists, composers, and scientists? What makes someone talented or even a genius? No doctor, psychologist, or philosopher has cracked that code yet. But we love inventing little signs that supposedly reveal hidden brilliance. One of the most popular, dyslexia, often labeled as the creative person's disorder. But is that actually true? Let's start with the basics. Dyslexia is a specific learning difference. In simple terms, reading is really hard for dyslexic people. It usually shows up in childhood. A kid mixes up syllables, forgets letters he already learned, guesses more than he reads, jumps from line to line, and struggles to grasp the meaning of a sentence. Writing isn't easier. That's called dysgraphia, and it almost always comes bundled with dyslexia. Letters get flipped, handwriting is chaotic, spelling is a battlefield. At first, dyslexia was mistaken for a form of autism, but it quickly became clear. Dyslexic people don't have issues with vision, hearing, speech, imagination, associative thinking, or intelligence. In fact, their IQ is usually perfectly normal or higher. So why can physically and mentally healthy people with strong intellect struggle with something any average student can do? There's no single answer. Some scientists blame the cerebellum, saying it struggles to link letters with the sounds they represent. Others think the issue lies in communication between the brain's hemispheres. Some point to vision. Maybe dyslexic people don't coordinate both eyes well. And many note that dyslexia often comes with hyperactivity, making focus harder. But all theories agree on one thing: dyslexia needs support and correction. Yet, the list of dyslexic high achievers is huge. Hans Christian Andersen, Albert Einstein, Michael Faraday, Vladimir Mayakovsky, Steve Jobs, Charlie Chaplin, Marilyn Monroe, Tom Cruise, Keira Knightley. Should they all have been treated? Why, if they were already brilliant? This brings us to one of the most interesting theories, not about why dyslexia appears, but what it signals. Some neuroscientists believe dyslexia might actually be an evolutionary advantage. Think about it. Reading is not natural for humans. Speech came long before writing. Our brains still think in images, not printed symbols. 200,000 years ago, nobody cared about silent reading. They cared about feeding their kids, hunting buffalo, and not becoming lion snacks. According to one idea, the dyslexic brain simply rejects reading as a low-priority task. It's busy solving bigger problems, like relativity, and dyslexia isn't the only flaw with hidden benefits. Take OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. Today it looks like constant hand-washing or checking the stove every 5 minutes. But in prehistoric times, hypervigilance kept you alive. A rustle in the bushes could mean death. Paranoia was survival. So imagine a modern guy inheriting this evolutionary gift, only to be told by a doctor, who wouldn't last 5 minutes in the wild, that he's overreacting. As always, things are complicated. You probably won't become a legend just because you have dyslexia or OCD. Success still takes massive effort, and society isn't about to worship people with learning differences. But if reading isn't your thing, don't panic. Try physics. Try painting. Try anything where your brain's strengths shine. Evolution didn't forget you, and that's baby science for you. The internet is full of videos of cats and dogs that talk. Cute? Absolutely. Real? Not even close. Animals don't speak the way we do, but they definitely communicate. Your dog marks a tree on a walk. and every other dog instantly knows who passed by. Monkeys and rodents warn their group about predators. Animals use posture, scent, and sound to send messages. But can we call that a language? In some cases, yes, and surprisingly, one of the most advanced animal communication systems belongs to bees. But let's not jump ahead. First, what even counts as a language? It sounds simple, but it's not. American linguist Charles Hockett spent years comparing human languages with animal communication systems. He identified 16 features that all human languages share, and only a few animals come even close. Here are 4 of the most important ones: discreteness, interchangeability, displacement, and openness. Discreteness means you can build millions of messages from a limited set of symbols. With just 26 English letters, you can write Shakespeare, or a chaotic TikTok comment. But a dog wagging its tail? That's one whole signal. You can't break it into smaller, meaningful parts. No matter how fast or slow the wag is, the message stays the same: I'm friendly. Ground squirrels, though, they're impressive. Take the Richardson's ground squirrel. It uses short chirps for aerial predators and trills, basically rapid chirps, for ground predators. Different sounds equals different danger levels. Combine them, and you get messages like, "Hey, something's flying above us," or "Run, there's a weasel." Interchangeability means the sender and receiver can swap roles. Any human can say, "I'm cold," and anyone else can say it back. But take the stickleback fish. A female signals she's ready to mate by showing her swollen belly. The male responds by changing color. They communicate, but they can't swap signals. The male can't grow eggs, and the female can't turn bright red. Gibbons, on the other hand, pass the test. Any gibbon can announce, "I found food," and any other gibbon understands. Displacement is the ability to talk about the past, the future, or things not currently visible. A dog wagging its tail or a fish showing its belly, that's strictly here and now. Openness means you can create brand new messages. Even if you've never been bitten by a snake, you can still understand someone saying, "A snake bit me." Gibbons can't do that. Their vocabulary is basically danger or food. That's it. And now, bees. Their communication system doesn't meet all 16 of Hockett's criteria. But it checks off the 4 we just covered, which is already wild. Bees communicate through dances. Zoologist Carl von Frisch was the first to decode their system. He noticed that if one bee found syrup, soon the whole hive showed up. Watching bees in a glass hive, he discovered how they share information. A scout bee returns from foraging, flaps her wings, and spreads the scent of whatever she touched. The others memorize the smell. If she performs a round dance, the food is close, within about 100 meters. If it's farther away, she performs a waggle dance, shaking her abdomen while moving in a figure 8 pattern. The angle of the waggle tells the direction relative to the sun. A scout bee returns from foraging, flaps her wings, and spreads the scent of whatever she touched. The others memorize the smell. If she performs a round dance, the food is close, within about 100 meters. If it's farther away, she performs a waggle dance, shaking her abdomen while moving in a figure 8 pattern. The angle of the waggle tells the direction relative to the sun. So even if animals don't talk the way we do, their communication systems are far more complex than they seem. Who knows? Maybe they even think to themselves, "It's nice to have someone to talk to, just in case." And that's baby science for you.